The Iron Wolves motorcycle gang terrorizes 67-year-old cattle rancher Frank, cutting his fences and threatening his life while demanding he sell his family land for pennies. 20 leather-clad thugs surround the old soldier's ranch house, revving engines and making death threats as their leader holds a gun to Frank's head in the town square. But what these criminal scumbags don't realize is that the quiet environmental consultant watching from the neighboring property is Steven Seagal himself. The legendary aikido master has been living peacefully in the Montana wilderness, but now these drug-dealing parasites have made the fatal mistake of terrorizing an innocent veteran in front of a man who spent decades destroying bullies with his bare hands. While the biker leader counts down Frank's final seconds, the martial arts legend moves through the shadows like a ghost, systematically dismantling their operation piece by piece. The gang wakes up to find their bikes sabotaged, their sentries missing, and their drug operation crumbling under attacks from an invisible enemy who fights like a demon but moves like the wind. What happens when you threaten the wrong rancher? In the wrong valley? Will any of these leather-clad cowards survive learning why some legends never retire? What happened next would terrorize the Iron Wolves for the rest of their pathetic criminal lives. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The peaceful Montana town of Cedar Ridge baked under the late summer sun, its 847 residents moving through their Tuesday afternoon routines with the unhurried rhythm of rural life. Elderly residents occupied their usual spots on the post office steps, sharing weather predictions and gossip while children played in the small park beside the library. The only sounds disturbing the tranquil air were distant cattle lowing from surrounding ranches and the gentle hum of overworked air conditioners struggling against the August heat. Then the thunder came. 20 Harley-Davidson motorcycles roared into town in perfect formation, their chrome gleaming like weapons in the afternoon sun, engines bellowing like mechanical beasts hungry for destruction. The Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club had arrived in Cedar Ridge, and their presence transformed the peaceful atmosphere instantly from serene to electric with menace. Rex Razor Morrison led the pack, his weathered face scanning the wide main street, with the calculating eyes of a predator surveying new hunting grounds. At 45, prison tattoos decorated his arms like a roadmap of violence, and his cold blue eyes missed nothing as he cataloged the town's vulnerabilities: sparse population, wide streets perfect for motorcycle maneuvers, and the kind of isolation that made outside interference unlikely. The bikers parked in a diagonal line outside Mabel's diner, their leather-clad presence causing immediate panic among the locals. Shop doors closed quietly, children were hurried indoors, and the normal sounds of small-town life died as if someone had thrown a switch. The Iron Wolves dismounted with practiced intimidation, their boots hitting asphalt in unison like soldiers. Occupying conquered territory, Tommy Tank Rodriguez, all 6'3" and 250 pounds of scarred muscle, cracked his knuckles while surveying the nervous faces peering from behind curtains. Diesel McKenzie adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and pulled out a smartphone, already calculating logistics and opportunities with the cold efficiency that made him Rex's most valuable lieutenant. Rex stood in the diner doorway like a general, surveying a battlefield, his presence causing the nervous waitress to drop her coffee pot with a crash that seemed to echo through the sudden silence. He dropped a $20 bill on the counter for a single cup of coffee, his smile never reaching his eyes. "Keep the change, sweetheart," he said, his voice carrying just enough menace to make her hands shake. "We're going to be neighbors." He turned toward the distant mountains where smoke rose from ranch houses scattered across the valley, pointing toward the largest spread visible on the horizon. "That's where we start," he told Tank, his words carrying the promise of storm clouds gathering over Cedar Ridge. Frank Donnelly walked his fence line with the methodical precision of a man who had spent 67 years understanding that details mattered. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across his Double D ranch as he checked each post and wire for damage from yesterday's thunderstorm, his weathered hands finding problems his sharp eyes might miss despite decades of experience. The tire tracks in the soft earth near his eastern boundary stopped him cold. Fresh motorcycle treads, multiple bikes, pressed deep into ground that had been empty yesterday. Frank knelt beside the tracks, his military training automatically cataloging details. At least 15 to 20 machines, stopped here long enough to leave clear impressions, recent enough that the edges hadn't yet been softened by wind or small animals. 30 yards further, he found his no trespassing signs torn down and thrown into the brush like discarded trash. Frank retrieved his binoculars from the truck and climbed onto his porch for a better view of the Henderson property. Old Henry had died 3 years ago, leaving the ranch abandoned and slowly returning to wilderness. Through the lenses, Frank counted approximately 20 motorcycles parked in what had been Henry's front yard, arranged with military precision. That suggested organization rather than random camping. That he reached for his phone to call Sheriff Coleman. Then remembered, Coleman was in Billings for court hearings and wouldn't return until Thursday. Deputy Janet Mills answered instead, her voice already tired though the day was barely half over. "Frank, what's the problem? Got uninvited guests on the Henderson place. Motorcycles, maybe 20 bikes, tore down my signs and left tracks on my property. I'll swing by when I can, but I'm covering 3 counties until Coleman gets back. Can't promise it'll be today." Frank hung up, understanding the reality. Mills was a good deputy, but one person couldn't handle everything. He looked through the binoculars again, noting the organized arrangement of the bikes, the systematic way gear was arranged, the discipline that marked these people as more than casual troublemakers. As darkness approached, he loaded his Winchester. 30-06. Not from paranoia, but from the learned caution of a Vietnam veteran who understood that preparation prevented problems. Through his kitchen window, he could see distant campfire light from the Henderson property and hear faint sounds of laughter and engines. Frank settled into his kitchen chair with a cup of coffee and a clear view of both his driveway and eastern pasture. Whatever these people wanted, they'd chosen the wrong rancher to intimidate. 3 generations of Donnellys had worked this land, and no gang of thugs would take it without a fight. But first, he needed to understand exactly what he was fighting. Steven Seagal's modest Ford pickup moved along the mountain road with unhurried precision, stopping periodically as he consulted environmental monitoring equipment with the methodical care of a man who understood that small details often revealed large truths. At 72, he moved with the fluid grace of someone whose body remained a finely tuned instrument despite the passage of years. The morning collection of water samples from Willow Creek had become routine over the past 8 months, but today something was different. His trained eye detected chemical traces that hadn't appeared in previous tests, industrial runoff suggesting unusual activity upstream that violated every environmental protection standard for this pristine watershed. Fresh motorcycle tracks pressed into the creek bank caught his attention immediately. Beer bottles floated in an eddy where clear water should run uncontaminated, and the normal symphony of morning birdsong was conspicuously absent. Even the deer tracks showed animals avoiding their traditional watering spots, driven away by disturbances that went against the natural patterns Steven had studied since arriving in this remote Montana valley. His environmental consultant work provided perfect cover for the solitary lifestyle he preferred, but it also meant he noticed things others missed. Wildlife didn't lie when creatures that had used the same paths for generations suddenly changed their behavior. Smart men paid attention to the reasons why. Steven packaged his water samples with scientific precision, photographing contaminated areas and recording GPS coordinates with the thoroughness that had served him well throughout careers in law enforcement and federal service. Whatever was happening upstream represented more than casual camping or temporary presence. As he loaded his truck, smoke rising from the Henderson property drew his attention. The abandoned ranch had stood empty since old Henry's death, but now it showed signs of organized occupation that suggested permanence rather than transient use. Steven drove home to his modest cabin, where 20 acres of pristine wilderness provided the peace he'd sought after decades of confronting humanity's darker impulses. His morning Tai Chi routine in the garden usually centered his mind for the day's work, but today he moved through the forms with extra attention to combat applications rather than simple exercise. The water samples would be analyzed, reports filed, and proper authorities notified through official channels. But Steven's instincts, honed by years of reading situations and people, suggested that official responses might prove inadequate for whatever was establishing itself in his quiet valley. He'd seen this pattern before, organized criminals choosing isolated communities where law enforcement was stretched thin and local resistance seemed unlikely. The methodology was always the same: establish a base, intimidate potential opposition, then expand operations until extraction became impossible without significant force. Some problems required official solutions. Others needed more direct intervention. Steven would monitor the situation carefully and hope for the former while preparing for the latter. Frank was repairing a water trough in his south pasture when the thunderous sound of approaching motorcycles cut through the afternoon stillness like chainsaws through silk. 5 Harleys roared onto his property in formation, ignoring posted signs and open gates with the casual arrogance of men accustomed to taking what they wanted without permission. Rex Morrison dismounted with theatrical friendliness, his smile never reaching the cold calculation behind his eyes. Tank Rodriguez and 3 others flanked him while Diesel McKenzie remained mounted, ready to relay communications or provide quick escape if circumstances required tactical withdrawal. "Afternoon, neighbor," Rex called out, approaching with the false bonhomie of a door-to-door salesman. "Figured it was time we introduced ourselves, being as we're going to be sharing water rights and all." Frank emerged from his house, carrying his Winchester across his forearm, not pointed at anyone, but clearly available if circumstances changed. At 67, he still carried himself with the straight-backed posture of a career soldier, and his steel blue eyes showed no trace of intimidation despite being outnumbered 5-1. "Don't recall anyone mentioning shared water rights," Frank replied evenly. "That's private property you're squatting on, and this is private property you're trespassing on." Rex's laugh held no warmth. "Now, old-timer, that's not very neighborly. We're just trying to reach an understanding here. Might be we could work something out that benefits everybody concerned." The conversation continued with surface civility masking obvious threats. Rex probed for information about family members, neighboring ranchers, law enforcement response times, and community connections with the systematic thoroughness of someone planning extended operations. Frank provided minimal responses, his military training evident in the way he controlled information while assessing enemy capabilities. Tank clearly wanted immediate violence, his scarred hands flexing around a tire iron while he studied Frank's house for tactical advantages and defensive positions. Rex restrained his enforcer with subtle gestures, recognizing that premature escalation might bring unwanted law enforcement attention before their operation was fully established. "Thing is," Rex continued, his tone shifting subtly toward menace, "developments coming to this valley whether folks like it or not. Smart people get ahead of progress instead of getting run over by it." Frank's response was cut short by the sound of an approaching vehicle. "Already called the sheriff," he said calmly. "Figured they'd want to meet the new neighbors too." Rex exchanged glances with his men, clearly calculating whether to escalate or withdraw. Tank's accidental kick that overturned Frank's porch furniture sent a clear message about future consequences of resistance, but Rex chose tactical retreat over immediate confrontation. "We'll be in touch," Rex promised, remounting his Harley. "Lots to discuss about community cooperation." 20 minutes later, Deputy Mills arrived to find only damaged property and Frank's growing certainty that these weren't casual troublemakers, but organized criminals planning extended operations in his valley. Frank's military training had taught him to sleep lightly, so when wire cutters began snipping through his eastern fence at 2:30 a.m., he was awake and reaching for his rifle before his conscious mind fully processed the sound. Flashlight beams danced near his property line like fireflies, accompanied by muffled voices speaking in the careful whispers of men conducting illegal business. By the time he dressed and reached the fence line, the intruders had vanished into darkness, leaving behind 3 gaping holes in his wire and the unmistakable evidence of their handiwork. 43 head of cattle wandered onto Highway 287, their confusion evident as they milled around unfamiliar territory in the pre-dawn gloom. Frank spent 4 exhausting hours on foot and horseback, rounding up panicked animals from a 2-mile stretch of dangerous road while praying no late-night truckers would encounter livestock in their headlights. The work was made more difficult by his aging body and the old war wound that flared when stress aggravated the shrapnel still lodged in his left thigh. As sunrise painted the mountains gold, Frank discovered the full scope of the night's damage. Two head remained missing: Thunder, his prize Angus bull worth $12,000, and a pregnant heifer due to calf within the month. Motorcycle tracks leading toward the Henderson property told the story clearly enough, along with discarded beer bottles marking where the fence cutters had celebrated their work. Exhausted and angry, Frank spent the morning repairing his fence with temporary materials before driving to the Henderson property to confront the thieves. He found Tank Rodriguez and three others working on motorcycles in the yard, their casual demeanor suggesting they had no concerns about legal consequences for their nighttime activities. Tank approached Frank's truck with obvious hostile intent, wielding a tire iron like a medieval mace. "You lose some cattle, old man. Maybe you need better fences." Frank climbed out slowly, his Winchester visible in the gun rack, but secured by choice rather than inability. "I want my bull and heifer back." "Prove they're yours," Tank sneered, while other bikers gathered with the pack mentality of predators surrounding isolated prey. Outnumbered 20-1 and recognizing a trap when he saw one, Frank withdrew, but his parting words carried the promise of future reckoning. "This isn't finished." Steven Seagal noticed the unusual activity from his cabin porch during his morning coffee. Cattle scattered along Highway 287 where none should be, and the obvious signs of emergency fence repair work visible across the valley at Frank's ranch. Through binoculars, he observed the older man's obvious exhaustion and what appeared to be a pronounced limp that hadn't been evident in their few previous encounters. His environmental monitoring work had made Steven intimately familiar with property boundaries and land use patterns throughout the valley. The sight of fresh fence cuts and missing livestock suggested escalation from intimidation to outright theft, a pattern he'd seen before in other isolated communities targeted by organized crime. After watching Frank struggle alone with repairs for 2 hours, Steven loaded basic tools into his truck and drove across the valley to offer assistance. Frank's initial suspicion was understandable. 8 months of being neighbors had produced only brief waves and polite nods. But Steven's quiet manner and obvious competence with fence repair gradually won grudging acceptance. Working side by side splicing wire and resetting posts, Steven asked careful questions about the motorcycle tracks and missing cattle. Frank, desperate for an ally after facing the bikers alone, explained the escalating situation while they restored his property's security. When Frank stumbled on uneven ground, his old war wound betraying him at a crucial moment, Steven caught him with surprising speed and strength. Their eyes met across that moment of vulnerability. Two warriors recognizing each other despite differences in age and background, understanding passing between them without need for words. "3rd Infantry Division," Frank said quietly, testing whether this stranger understood military service. "I know the unit," Steven replied. "Good soldiers." As they finished the fence repair, Steven mentioned that his environmental monitoring had detected unusual chemical activity upstream, and wildlife patterns suggested significant disturbance in areas that should remain pristine. He offered to keep watch from his property and provided his phone number with quiet sincerity. Frank accepted gratefully, realizing for the first time in days that he wasn't completely alone against whatever was developing in his valley. As Steven drove away, Frank found himself studying his neighbor's movements and bearing more carefully. There was something about the man that suggested capabilities beyond environmental consulting, something that might prove valuable in the days ahead. The rumble of many motorcycles approaching from multiple directions sent Frank's cattle into nervous motion across his south pasture. 20 bikes in formation plus additional members in pickup trucks surrounded his ranch house with military precision that demonstrated coordination and planning far beyond simple criminal opportunism. Rex Morrison dismounted like a general reviewing conquered territory, carrying a manila folder with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through superior force. His approach to Frank's porch mimicked a friendly door-to-door salesman, but the coordinated engine revving and shouted threats from his men created a wall of intimidation that rattled windows and terrified livestock. "Got a business proposition for you, Frank," Rex announced, producing a land purchase contract with terms so insulting they bordered on theft. $50,000 for property worth 10 times that amount. Figured it was time we settled this. Neighbor's situation permanent-like. Frank remained on his porch, Winchester across his knees, refusing to be drawn into Rex's carefully staged theater. The bikers had positioned themselves to control all approaches to his house and clearly studied his property layout during previous reconnaissance. This wasn't random intimidation, but systematic psychological warfare. Not interested in selling. Frank replied calmly. The coordinated engine revving that followed created mechanical thunder designed to demonstrate helplessness against organized force. When Frank called Deputy Mills, she arrived 30 minutes later with one backup officer from a neighboring county. Two law enforcement officers facing more than 20 heavily armed criminals created obviously inadequate opposition. Mills took statements from both parties while Rex played his role perfectly, claiming they were simply making a legitimate business offer to an uncooperative neighbor. His mock sincerity and surface cooperation made legal intervention impossible without clear evidence of criminal activity. As law enforcement departed, Rex's final words carried unmistakable threat despite their polite phrasing. Think about our offer, Frank. We'll be back tomorrow when you've had time to consider things properly and when you're not distracted by visitors. The bikers withdrew in formation, but Frank noticed several remained posted on the Henderson property with clear sight lines to his ranch house. He was now under constant surveillance, his movements monitored and his isolation confirmed. Whatever came next, he would face it without official protection or legal recourse. The war for his land had begun in earnest. Frank sat on his porch as evening shadows lengthened, rifle across his knees and binoculars focused on the Henderson property. His military mind automatically calculated odds and resources, finding the mathematics discouragingly one-sided. 20-plus armed enemies with tactical coordination against one aging rancher with limited ammunition and no backup created an equation that favored overwhelming defeat. Steven's approach through the tree line demonstrated reconnaissance skills that most civilians didn't possess. His sudden appearance startled Frank until recognition replaced alarm, followed immediately by respect for movement techniques that suggested professional training in covert operations. "You saw what happened today?" Frank said. It wasn't a question. "I saw," Steven replied, settling onto the porch steps with the fluid grace of someone whose body remained a precision instrument despite advancing years. "Tell me about Vietnam." Over coffee and gathering darkness, Frank found himself sharing war stories he rarely discussed. The Bronze Star action that cost him shrapnel in his thigh, the friends lost to enemy action, the brotherhood forged in combat that lasted decades beyond the fighting. Steven listened with the understanding of someone who recognized military experience from personal knowledge rather than secondhand information. Sometimes the best weapon isn't the biggest gun, Steven observed quietly. Sometimes it's knowing how to use what you have against enemies who underestimate what they're facing. Something in Steven's tone made Frank study his neighbor's weathered features more carefully. The confident posture, obvious martial arts conditioning, and analytical approach to tactical problems suggested capabilities that went far beyond environmental consulting. "I know you from somewhere," Frank said slowly, pieces of recognition beginning to assemble in his memory. Steven met his gaze steadily, patient silence stretching between them until Frank's eyes widened with sudden understanding. The face was older, marked by years and weather, but unmistakable once identified. "Maybe from the movies," Steven said simply. The distant sound of motorcycle engines starting at the Henderson property interrupted their moment of recognition. Steven's head cocked like a hunting dog detecting prey, his entire bearing shifting, subtly from peaceful neighbor to something far more dangerous. "They're moving," he said quietly, watching distant headlights as several bikes left the Henderson property. "Tomorrow's going to be interesting." Rex's promise to return when Frank was alone had taken on entirely new meaning. The rancher was no longer isolated. He had Steven Seagal watching his back. Steven arrived at Frank's ranch before dawn, carrying a thermos of herbal tea and moving with the quiet confidence of someone comfortable in dangerous situations. In Frank's kitchen, he shared his philosophy over steaming cups, speaking in measured tones about balance, harmony, and the responsibility that came with true strength. "Most people think martial arts is about fighting," Steven said, demonstrating a subtle aikido movement that seemed to flow like water. But real warriors understand it's about protection, using an opponent's aggression against them, redirecting their force instead of meeting violence with violence. Frank watched with growing fascination as Steven showed how a simple wrist turn could neutralize a much larger opponent, how positioning and timing mattered more than raw strength. Despite his famous neighbor's identity, Frank found himself asking direct questions about Steven's background, law enforcement experience, military training, the philosophy behind disciplines that made legends. Steven answered selectively, focusing on principles rather than specific details, but Frank gained understanding of capabilities that went far beyond movie stunts. This was a man who had spent decades learning to protect rather than simply destroy, whose reputation was built on genuine skill rather than Hollywood fiction. 20-plus bikers with organized leadership and limited law enforcement response. Steven analyzed, his tone shifting to tactical assessment. Conventional approaches won't work against people operating outside legal boundaries. Sometimes you have to speak the language your enemy understands. This represented Steven's philosophy in practical terms. Exhaust peaceful solutions first, but when facing predators who only respected force, provide that force with surgical precision and overwhelming effectiveness. As Steven prepared to leave, he demonstrated a simple aikido technique on Frank, redirecting the older man's push into a gentle throw that left him on his back, but completely unharmed. The principle applies to more than physical confrontation, Steven explained, helping Frank to his feet. Sometimes the hardest force to resist is the one that doesn't oppose you directly. Frank practiced the movement after Steven drove away, beginning to understand that his neighbor offered more than moral support. The war for his ranch had acquired a general who understood both strategy and tactics at levels that made victory possible rather than simply hoped for it. Steven's environmental consultant truck provided perfect cover as he conducted detailed surveillance of the Henderson property, ostensibly collecting routine water quality samples while actually beginning systematic intelligence gathering on the Iron Wolves operation. His telephoto lenses and professional equipment attracted no suspicious attention from enemies who saw only a harmless bureaucrat doing tedious government work. What he discovered through careful observation went far beyond simple squatting. The bikers had established a sophisticated drug operation involving modified trailers, generator-powered equipment, and regular traffic from out-of-state vehicles that arrived with clockwork precision. Through glimpses of packaging materials and digital scales visible through open doors, Steven recognized a major distribution center rather than casual criminal activity. His law enforcement background helped him catalog license plates, document faces, and identify the systematic modifications to Henderson's property that violated numerous federal statutes. The land intimidation wasn't random bullying. It represented strategic expansion to control trafficking routes and provide legitimate cover for interstate drug distribution. Steven's analysis revealed tactical patterns that could be exploited. Most bikers departed during late afternoon for business in surrounding towns, returning after midnight with reduced alertness from long rides and chemical impairment. Rex maintained discipline among his troops, but personality conflicts existed between Tank's desire for immediate violence and Diesel's preference for careful planning. The environmental monitoring also served genuine scientific purposes. Chemical contamination from drug processing was poisoning Willow Creek, killing fish, and driving away wildlife that had used these waters for generations. Personal offense combined with professional duty to create motivation that went beyond simple neighbor assistance. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Steven packed surveillance equipment with scientific precision, having documented enough evidence to involve federal agencies in investigations that could dismantle the entire operation. But that process required weeks or months, time Frank didn't have with Rex's patience clearly exhausted. From concealment, Steven watched through binoculars as Rex and Tank approached Frank's house again, their body language suggesting escalation rather than negotiation. He remained hidden, gathering intelligence rather than intervening, but his hand rested on communication equipment that could summon help if circumstances required immediate action. The Iron Wolves had made their territorial intentions clear. Now Steven needed to demonstrate why some territory remained beyond their reach. Betty Morrison's hands shook as she poured Frank's coffee at Mabel's diner, her nervous glances toward the window revealing terror that went beyond normal concern about the iron wolves parked outside. When she leaned close to whisper, Frank smelled fierce sweat mixed with cheap perfume and realized this woman held information she was desperate to share. "I'm Rex Morrison's sister," she confessed in barely audible tones. "I know what he's planning, and it's worse than you think." The family connection explained her inside knowledge and paralyzing fear. Betty revealed that Rex expected reinforcements from allied motorcycle clubs in Wyoming and Idaho, turning the local intimidation into a regional operation with resources that would overwhelm any community resistance. She knew about the drug trafficking, had been unknowingly funding it for 2 years while believing she was helping her brother go legitimate. "Our father used to beat us both," Betty explained, tears threatening to spill. "Rex protected me then, but prison changed him into someone I don't recognize. I've been sending money, thinking I was helping him get clean, but he used every dollar to build this poison operation." Frank realized Betty represented both valuable intelligence and a potential ally trapped by family loyalty and genuine fear. Her knowledge of Rex's timeline revealed the urgency. Reinforcements would arrive Sunday, followed by a final negotiation on Monday that would involve violence regardless of Frank's decision. Steven entered the diner during their whispered conversation, apparently for lunch, but actually providing security. His presence gave Betty courage to reveal more details about guard positions, daily routines, and the location of drug processing equipment hidden in modified trailers. She slipped Frank a hand-drawn map showing the Henderson property layout with remarkable accuracy, including blind spots in their security and vulnerable approaches to critical equipment. "I can't live with what my brother's become," she whispered. Steven caught Betty's eye and nodded slightly, a promise of protection that seemed to lift weight from her shoulders. As they prepared to leave, Frank understood they now possessed inside intelligence that could shift tactical balance, but also responsibility for protecting someone whose courage had made her a target for family retribution. Betty had chosen sides in a war she'd never wanted, making redemption possible but survival uncertain. The Iron Wolves began their pressure campaign with systematic harassment designed to appear accidental while creating mounting psychological stress and financial damage. Frank's tractor suffered mysterious engine failure after sugar contaminated the fuel system. His hay baler's hydraulic lines were severed with surgical precision, and sand in his truck's gearbox created grinding destruction that would cost thousands. To repair, his water tank, contaminated with motor oil, forced Frank to haul water by hand for 43 head of cattle, backbreaking labor that would challenge men half his age. The small grass fire that started suspiciously close to his hay barn was quickly extinguished, but the arson was obvious despite lack of conclusive evidence. Each incident was crafted with criminal sophistication to avoid prosecution while creating cumulative damage that would eventually break most victims' resolve. The methodology demonstrated experience with intimidation campaigns designed to appear like bad luck rather than organized harassment. Deputy Mills investigated each incident with professional thoroughness, but found no evidence strong enough for arrests. The bikers maintained alibis, provided witnesses, and demonstrated plausible deniability for every act of sabotage. Mills was clearly intimidated by their organized presence and reluctant to push investigations without solid proof. The community impact spread beyond Frank's ranch as other ranchers and townspeople began avoiding him, afraid of becoming secondary targets in a conflict that seemed to escalate daily. Doc Walsh treated Frank's stress-related symptoms, elevated blood pressure, insomnia, muscle tension from constant vigilance, while quietly expressing his own fears about the bikers' growing influence. Despite mounting pressure and physical exhaustion, Frank refused to consider selling. His military training helped him recognize psychological warfare tactics, but isolation and constant hyper-alertness took their toll on his aging body and grieving spirit. As Frank secured his property for another sleepless night, he noticed Steven watching from the neighboring ridge like a guardian angel maintaining protective overwatch. The sight provided comfort in knowing he wasn't completely alone against enemies who seemed to grow bolder with each successful attack. The dead coyote Frank found in his driveway the next morning had its throat cut with precision that left no doubt about the message's intent. The Iron Wolves were done with subtle intimidation. Direct threats would follow, Steven moved through pre-dawn darkness like a shadow, beginning his counter-campaign against the Iron Wolves with the systematic precision of someone who understood asymmetric warfare. At 4:30 a.m., while the bikers slept off their previous night's chemical indulgences, he initiated sabotage operations designed to appear like mechanical failure rather than enemy action. Sugar poured into gas tanks would crystallize and destroy engine components within hours. Sand mixed into oil systems created grinding destruction that mimicked normal wear patterns. Cut spark plug wires and loosened wheel bolts caused mysterious breakdowns that frustrated and demoralized without creating obvious evidence of sabotage. Steven's wilderness skills allowed him to move across the valley like a ghost, using game trails and creek beds to approach targets unseen. His environmental monitoring equipment provided perfect cover for reconnaissance missions, while his intimate knowledge of the Montana landscape became a tactical advantage no urban criminal could match. Psychological warfare complemented physical sabotage as Steven employed his understanding of criminal psychology to create paranoia within the Iron Wolves. Tools disappeared overnight and reappeared in impossible locations. Food supplies were contaminated with harmless but disgusting additives that made every meal suspicious. Personal items were rearranged subtly, suggesting invisible enemies had searched through their belongings. The bikers woke to find flat tires, dead batteries, and engine problems that defied explanation. Their organized discipline began showing stress fractures as members blamed each other for security failures that seemed to multiply despite increased vigilance. Rex maintained surface control through intimidation and threats, but Steven could observe growing tension within the group as Tank advocated for violent retaliation, while Diesel suggested they were facing federal agents or military intervention. Neither suspected a single environmental consultant was systematically dismantling their operation. From concealment, Steven watched Rex scream at his subordinates about security failures while motorcycles refused to start and equipment malfunctioned. With suspicious frequency, "Someone's making us look like amateurs," Rex shouted. "Find out who, or I'll find new people who can." Steven slipped away unseen, satisfied that psychological pressure was building on his enemies while Frank remained protected. The Iron Wolves were learning that some valleys harbored predators more dangerous than themselves. Frank decided to take the initiative rather than remain on the defensive, driving to town with the determination of an old soldier who understood that sometimes strategic offense provided better protection than tactical retreat. The mysterious setbacks plaguing the bikers had created an opportunity that military training taught him to exploit before circumstances shifted again. He found Rex and most of the Iron Wolves gathered outside Mabel's diner, their frustrated expressions suggesting mechanical problems had disrupted their normal intimidation routines. Frank parked deliberately close to their disabled motorcycles and climbed out with the confident bearing of someone no longer afraid of superior numbers. "You've got until sundown tomorrow to pack up and leave," Frank announced loud enough for gathering townspeople to hear clearly. "After that, you deal with the consequences." The public confrontation drew spectators who had been intimidated into silence for days, but Frank's courage inspired others to find their own voices. Doc Walsh stepped forward to support him, followed by several local business owners who had watched their community terrorized by criminals operating with apparent impunity. Rex, frustrated by recent mechanical failures and not wanting to appear weak before his men and the watching town, agreed to a public meeting the next day to settle things like men. His proposal seemed reasonable. Noon in the town square to discuss terms and reach final resolution. Steven watched from across the street, pretending to read a newspaper while actually providing Overwatch security. His analytical mind recognized Rex's agreement as likely deception, too easy after days of escalation and systematic harassment. Men like Rex didn't surrender territory. They relocated battles to terrain that favored their advantages. The community support surprised Frank with its warmth and determination. Business owners offered supplies and moral backing, while Doc Walsh volunteered to witness any agreement reached. The confrontation had transformed from personal harassment to community resistance against organized crime. That evening, Steven visited Frank's ranch to praise his courage while warning about probable treachery. Men like Rex don't capitulate, they relocate the battlefield to their advantage. Steven cautioned with the voice of experience. Frank agreed to trust Steven's tactical judgment while maintaining his moral stand. Whatever Rex planned, Frank would face it with courage rather than surrender principles that had sustained him through war and widowhood. Frank drove toward town for the agreed meeting with his Winchester secured in the gun rack and his resolve firm despite Steven's warnings about deception. The morning sun painted the mountains gold as he approached what he expected would be final negotiations with Rex and the Iron Wolves. The trap revealed itself immediately as Frank entered Cedar Ridge's main street. Not 20 bikers waited in the town square, but over 50. Rex had brought reinforcements from allied chapters in Wyoming and Idaho overnight, transforming local intimidation into regional occupation with overwhelming force. Armed bikers controlled strategic positions throughout downtown, the post office, bank, main intersection, and all roads leading out of town. This wasn't negotiation but demonstration of absolute power designed to crush resistance through psychological dominance rather than simple violence. Rex greeted Frank with theatrical courtesy, explaining that negotiations require proper representation from the motorcycle community. The meeting was revealed as carefully staged theater where Frank would stand alone in a town square controlled by hostile forces, his isolation complete and his helplessness obvious to any watching townspeople. The same insulting purchase contract appeared, but now accompanied by veiled threats against community members who had supported Frank's resistance. Accidents happen to more than just ranchers, Tank suggested meaningfully, looking toward the diner where Betty worked in obvious terror. Deputy Mills had been drawn away by coordinated false emergency calls claiming urgent situations in 3 neighboring counties, eliminating law enforcement presence during the crucial confrontation. Rex's planning had removed outside intervention as a possibility. Townspeople who had courageously supported Frank yesterday now watched from behind locked doors and drawn curtains as armed criminals patrolled their streets. The show of overwhelming force demonstrated Rex's power while emphasizing Frank's complete isolation. Rex set a timer on his phone with theatrical precision. 1 hour for Frank to sign the contract or face escalating consequences. After that, he announced loud enough for hidden residents to hear, "We stop asking nicely." Frank stood alone in the square, surrounded by 50 hostile bikers while Steven watched helplessly from concealment, calculating odds that favored catastrophic defeat. The timer showed 59 minutes and counting down toward what seemed like inevitable violence. Rex's timer showed 55 minutes remaining as Frank stood defiant despite impossible odds. His refusal to sign creating mounting tension that crackled through the occupied town square like electricity before lightning strikes. The Iron Wolves had transformed Cedar Ridge into a demonstration of criminal power designed to terrorize an entire region into compliance. Reinforcements from Wyoming and Idaho had brought the total occupation force to more than 50 armed bikers who systematically controlled every strategic position in town. Children remained hidden indoors, businesses stayed closed, and normal small-town life ceased completely under the weight of organized intimidation. Rex revealed his true intentions as the timer approached 30 minutes. The contract had always been secondary to establishing dominance through public example. "Even if you sign," he told Frank with cold satisfaction, "you've caused me too much trouble. Time to pay the price for thinking you could resist progress." Betty Morrison was forced to serve coffee to the bikers occupying the diner, her hands shaking with shame and terror as her brother's gang demonstrated their power over her neighbors and friends. Her earlier courage in helping Frank now seemed to have accomplished nothing except ensuring she would witness his destruction. From his concealed position, Steven calculated tactical options with professional detachment. Direct intervention meant exposing himself to overwhelming numbers in urban terrain that favored the enemy's superior firepower and coordinated positions. But watching Frank face execution while maintaining strategic advantage violated every principle Steven had lived by throughout decades of protecting innocent people. Rex drew his pistol and placed the barrel against Frank's temple while Tank forced the old rancher to his knees in full view of the terrified community. "Last chance, old man," Rex announced with theatrical cruelty. "Sign, or become a lesson about what happens to people who don't know their place." The timer reached 0 with mechanical finality. Rex cocked his pistol as Frank closed his eyes, refusing to surrender his principles, even facing death. Steven's hand moved toward his own weapon, knowing intervention meant probable death, but unable to watch evil triumph through good men's inaction. The sound of the pistol's hammer clicking into firing position seemed to echo through the suddenly silent town square, marking the moment when heroes must choose between safety and honored. A.S. Rex's finger tightened on the trigger. A distant police siren wailed across the valley. Betty Morrison's secret phone call to state police, creating momentary distraction. That saved Frank's life by seconds. Rex hesitated, his calculated cruelty disrupted by potential law enforcement complications he hadn't anticipated. The siren forced Rex to holster his weapon temporarily while reorganizing his forces to deal with official response. Frank was thrown into the storage shed behind Mabel's diner, buying precious time as Rex repositioned his men for tactical advantage against approaching authorities. The police proved to be a false alarm, merely a volunteer firefighter responding to a medical emergency 3 counties away, but the interruption gave Steven the opening he desperately needed. Under cover of the confusion, he retreated to his cabin for meditation and tactical preparation that would determine whether Frank lived or died. Steven moved through aikido forms that combined Eastern philosophy with Western combat planning, achieving the mental clarity necessary for operations against overwhelming odds. His preparation was methodical and complete. Tactical gear from his law enforcement days, communications equipment to contact federal colleagues, and weapons chosen for specific purposes rather than maximum firepower that he contacted former law enforcement associates, setting federal investigations in motion that would eventually dismantle the Iron Wolves' interstate drug operation. But those wheels turned slowly while Frank faced immediate execution, requiring direct action that transcended official channels. Betty Morrison managed to slip away from the diner during the reorganization chaos, reaching Steven with crucial intelligence about Rex's timeline. Her brother planned to execute Frank at sunset as a public example, then establish permanent control over Cedar Ridge through systematic terror that would eliminate all future resistance. Steven completed his preparation as afternoon shadows lengthened. Toward evening, his face showing the calm determination of a warrior entering battle with full understanding of probable consequences. He loaded carefully selected equipment into his truck and drove toward town, parking in concealment outside the occupied area. 4 hours remained until sunset. 4 hours to save Frank's life and liberate a community held hostage by organized evil. Steven checked his watch one final time, then began moving through familiar terrain toward a confrontation that would test every skill acquired through decades of training for moments exactly like this. Steven moved through the forest surrounding Cedar Ridge like a ghost, using game trails and creek beds to approach the occupied town undetected, while systematic elimination of the bikers' tactical advantages began with surgical precision. His intimate knowledge of the terrain became a weapon more effective than any firearm against enemies who had never learned to read landscape as language. Sentries posted on the town's perimeter disappeared silently, found hours later bound with zip ties and unconscious from precisely applied pressure point techniques that caused no permanent damage while removing threats permanently. Steven's aikido mastery allowed him to neutralize guards without alerting their companions, creating growing gaps in the Iron Wolves' defensive coverage. Motorcycles throughout the occupied zone suffered systematic sabotage, spark plugs removed. With surgical precision, tires deflated to render machines useless, gas lines cut to prevent emergency starts. Radio equipment disappeared or developed mysterious malfunctions that isolated the bikers from outside communication while creating confusion within their command structure. Steven employed psychological warfare with the calculated precision of someone who understood criminal psychology from professional experience. Unconscious guards were discovered with notes reading, "You're next," tucked into their pockets, while equipment disappeared and reappeared in impossible locations that suggested supernatural intervention or military-level infiltration. The bikers began experiencing paranoia that spread through their ranks like infection as rational explanations for their systematic defeats became increasingly impossible. Members started suspecting federal agents, special forces intervention, or even supernatural retribution for their crimes against innocent people. Rex maintained surface discipline through intimidation and threats, but his forces were reduced to fewer than 30 effective fighters as reinforcements either fled during the night or were found incapacitated in locations that defied logical explanation. The systematic defeats created demoralization that threatened unit cohesion. By nightfall, Steven had neutralized 15 bikers and disabled most of their transportation without being detected once. Rex discovered the scope of their losses when he attempted to organize defensive positions. Half his occupation force had vanished, and the remainder exhibited the nervous behavior of prey animals sensing predators in the darkness. "We're not fighting some old rancher," Rex realized with growing alarm as he counted missing men and disabled equipment. "Someone's hunting us like animals." Rex sent his remaining forces into the wilderness to locate their tormentor, not realizing he was playing directly into Steven's tactical plan by dispersing concentrated strength across terrain that favored individual combat over coordinated group action. The Montana landscape became Steven's ally against enemies who had never learned to fight outside urban environments. Steven used the bikers' aggression against them with aikido principles applied to asymmetric warfare, leading search teams into carefully prepared ambush sites where superior numbers became liability rather than advantage. Dense forest prevented motorcycle pursuit, while rocky terrain channeled foot movement into killing zones where single combat skills determined outcomes. Individual bikers found themselves isolated and facing an opponent whose martial arts mastery turned their violence against them with devastating effectiveness. Steven's techniques were precisely calibrated. Pressure points and submission holds that neutralized threats permanently but humanely, proving that skill and wisdom could triumph over numbers and brutality. Search teams returned beaten and demoralized, reporting encounters with an enemy who fought like a demon but moved like the wind. Their descriptions varied wildly. Sometimes a bearded mountain man who appeared from nowhere, other times a shadow that struck without warning before vanishing into forest that seemed to swallow human presence. The systematic defeats began breaking down group cohesion among Rex's remaining forces. Tank advocated for immediate retreat, arguing they were facing federal agents or special forces intervention that exceeded their capability to resist. Diesel suggested supernatural explanations when rational analysis failed to account for their losses. Steven demonstrated his environmental warfare expertise by using the landscape as a weapon, leading pursuers over cliff edges where footing became treacherous, through dense undergrowth where visibility dropped to arm's length, across creek beds that concealed tracks while exposing enemy movement to observation. Each confrontation illustrated Steven's martial arts philosophy through practical application. Multiple attackers found their coordinated assaults redirected into self-defeating chaos as Steven's aikido techniques used their aggression to generate throws, joint locks, and pressure point strikes that ended conflicts without excessive violence. Rex's effective force was reduced to fewer than 20 fighters by dawn, with most reinforcements having fled during the night rather than face an enemy who seemed to control the very landscape against them. The Iron Wolves were learning that some territory remained beyond their ability to conquer through conventional criminal methods. Betty Morrison led Doc Walsh and several townspeople to the storage shed where Frank was imprisoned, using keys stolen during the previous night's chaos, while demoralized bikers maintained insufficient security around their hostage. Her courage in returning to help Frank demonstrated redemption earned through actions rather than intentions. Frank's rescue revealed the full scope of Rex's criminal enterprise as Betty shared intelligence gathered over months of unwilling participation. The drug distribution network spanned 3 states with connections to organized crime families, while territorial expansion plans targeted dozens of rural communities for systematic criminal occupation and control. Doc Walsh treated Frank's injuries from his beating and overnight imprisonment while townspeople learned the truth about their situation. The Iron Wolves represented more than local intimidation. They were advanced forces for regional criminal conquest that would transform their peaceful valley into a drug trafficking corridor protected by systematic terror. Steven emerged from the shadows as his identity was revealed to the assembled community members, his legendary status transforming their despair into hope for the first time in days. The sight of a genuine action hero committed to their protection provided psychological reinforcement that made resistance seem possible rather than suicidal. Frank insisted on participating in the final confrontation despite his injuries, his military pride refusing protection while neighbors faced danger. Stephen outlined strategy that would divide Rex's remaining forces, isolate the leader from his support structure, and force a climactic showdown on tactical terms that minimized civilian casualties. The community mobilized actively for the first time, with Doc Walsh organizing medical support while local business owners provided supplies and communication coordination. Betty's detailed map of the Henderson property revealed defensive weaknesses and approach routes that could be exploited by someone with Steven's infiltration skills. Strategic planning combined Steven's tactical expertise with Frank's military experience and Betty's inside knowledge to create a comprehensive assault plan. The Iron Wolves' reduced numbers and demoralized condition provided opportunities that hadn't existed during their initial occupation phase. As dawn broke over Cedar Ridge, Stephen and Frank stood together on Main Street while townspeople watched from windows, no longer hiding in fear, but serving as witnesses to justice finally being delivered against organized evil. The final battle would determine whether their community remained free or fell under permanent criminal control. Stephen walked alone down Main Street at 8 a.m., his hands empty, but his posture radiating lethal capability as Rex and 15 remaining bikers formed a desperate defensive line outside Mabel's diner. The legendary action star moved with the fluid confidence of someone whose reputation was built on genuine skill rather than Hollywood fiction. Rex opened fire with his pistol, but Stephen demonstrated the supernatural speed that had made him famous, using superior positioning and aikido footwork to close distance while bullets passed through spaces his body no longer occupied. The first physical contact proved Stephen's mastery. He redirected Rex's gun hand while using the momentum to send the biker leader crashing through the diner's front window in an explosion of glass and splintered wood. Tank charged with a motorcycle chain, swinging the heavy links like a medieval flail, but Stephen transformed the weapon's momentum into Tank's downfall. Using Aikido principles of redirection rather than opposition, Stephen wrapped the chain around Tank's legs during his attack, toppling him into 3 other bikers in a cascade of criminal defeat. Each combat sequence illustrated Stephen's philosophy through devastating practical application. When bikers attacked with crude violence, Stephen responded with precise technique that neutralized multiple enemies simultaneously. His movements flowed like water around obstacles, redirecting rather than opposing force directly while creating opportunities for decisive counterattacks. The urban environment became part of Stephen's tactical arsenal as lampposts provided pivot points for throws, parked cars offered cover and created obstacles that channeled enemy movement, and the diner's confined interior space negated numerical superiority while favoring individual skill over coordinated group attacks. Diesel attempted to flank Stephen with a tire iron, but found himself disarmed and thrown into the town monument with bone-jarring impact that ended his participation permanently. The remaining bikers began showing the panic of predators suddenly facing superior predator, their confident brutality replaced by desperate survival instinct. Stephen stood calm in the street's center, apparently surrounded but actually controlling the tactical situation through superior positioning and combat awareness. Rex rallied his remaining forces for a final coordinated assault, but the legendary martial artist was prepared to demonstrate why some reputations transcend entertainment to become genuine capability. Frank stepped into the street despite Stephen's earlier instructions to remain concealed. His Winchester aimed steadily at Rex's escape route as the old soldier refused to let his friend face overwhelming odds alone. His appearance transformed the confrontation from individual heroics to coordinated military operation between warriors who understood mutual support under fire. The Aikido master and Vietnam veteran fought side by side. They're different, but complementary skills creating devastating synergy against demoralized criminals who had never faced genuine resistance. Stephen handled multiple attackers in close combat, while Frank provided covering fire and prevented flanking maneuvers with precision marksmanship that eliminated peripheral threats. Frank's military training meshed perfectly with Stephen's martial arts mastery as they protected each other's flanks and coordinated attacks with the wordless communication of experienced fighters. When Steven faced momentary, overwhelming numbers, Frank's rifle work thinned the opposition. When Frank needed to reload, Steven's defensive techniques protected them both. Betty Morrison appeared with a shotgun, choosing to stand against her brother rather than enable his crimes through family loyalty. Her intervention tipped several crucial moments, proving that redemption remained possible even for those connected to evil through blood relationships. Her courage inspired other townspeople to emerge from hiding and block escape routes. Tank made a final desperate charge with a broken bottle, but Frank's precise shot shattered the improvised weapon, while Steven's follow-up throw sent the massive enforcer crashing unconscious into the street. Diesel attempted to flee but found his path blocked by armed citizens who had finally found courage to resist organized intimidation. That Rex's desperation increased as his forces crumbled under coordinated assault from opponents whose skill exceeded anything he'd encountered in prison or street fighting. His threats and intimidation tactics proved useless against men who had faced genuine combat and emerged victorious through superior training and moral courage. The systematic defeat of his organization demonstrated the fundamental weakness of criminal enterprises built on fear rather than genuine strength. Rex found himself backed against the town square monument with only his pistol remaining, facing two legends whose combined capabilities made his situation hopeless. Steven and Frank approached from opposite directions, their tactical coordination forcing Rex into an inescapable position where surrender became the only alternative to complete destruction. The Iron Wolf's reign of terror was ending through the application of justice delivered by competent hands. Rex aimed his pistol desperately at Frank, while his last two lieutenants flanked Steven, but their desperation made them tactically predictable. Against opponents whose experience had taught them to read criminal behavior with deadly accuracy. The final confrontation would demonstrate why legends earned their reputations through genuine capability rather than manufactured fame. Steven's masterful aikido technique disarmed all three remaining criminals simultaneously in one flowing motion. That redirected Rex's gun hand while using the movement to throw Tank into Diesel, creating a cascade of defeats from a single precisely applied force. The demonstration proved that true martial arts mastery transcended individual techniques to become comprehensive combat philosophy. Rex, disarmed but refusing surrender, attempted hand-to-hand combat against Steven with the fury of someone whose criminal empire was dissolving around him. But street fighting and prison violence proved inadequate against decades of disciplined training, as Steven's techniques were precise, efficient, and decisive without being unnecessarily brutal. Federal agents arrived as the confrontation ended, summoned by Steven's earlier communications and finding a complete criminal operation documented and defeated by citizen action. The evidence Steven had gathered provided everything necessary for prosecution, while the bikers' own actions had created multiple witnesses to their interstate crimes. Townspeople emerged from hiding to witness Rex's arrest and the liberation of their community. Children playing in streets that had been empty for days while adults resumed normal business without fear of criminal retaliation. The psychological hold of organized intimidation was broken permanently through demonstration that evil could be defeated by good people with sufficient courage. Steven characteristically deflected credit for the victory, praising Frank's military courage and the community's ultimate resilience in standing together against criminal occupation. He emphasized that justice had been served through proper application of strength in defense of innocent people rather than through vengeance or excessive violence. Rex was led away in federal custody, his drug empire dismantled, and his territorial ambitions ended through systematic defeat that would serve as warning to other criminal organizations considering rural expansion. The Iron Wolves had learned that some communities possessed protectors whose capabilities exceeded criminal understanding. Justice had been served through the coordinated efforts of ordinary citizens who found extraordinary courage when their values were threatened. Cedar Ridge remained free because good people had refused to surrender to organized evil, proving that traditional American virtues still possessed the power to triumph over modern criminal enterprises. 3 weeks later, Frank fed his cattle in the restored South pasture as morning sun painted the mountains gold. His daily routine returned to peaceful normalcy, but his confidence permanently strengthened by recent events. The Double D Ranch prospered with community support as neighbors offered assistance that transformed isolation into belonging within the valley's social fabric. Thunder the prize bull and the pregnant heifer had been recovered unharmed from the Henderson property, returning Frank's livestock to full strength, while the successful calving provided hope for future prosperity. The experience had transformed Frank from isolated widower to respected community leader whose courage had inspired collective resistance against organized crime. Betty Morrison's small bakery thrived with earnings from federal rewards for information that had dismantled the Iron Wolves' interstate drug network. Her separation from Rex's criminal influence allowed natural goodness to flourish as she became a valued community member rather than victim of family circumstance, proving redemption possible through moral courage. Steven continued his environmental consulting work with open friendship throughout the valley, his true identity respected, rather than exploited by people who understood they had witnessed genuine heroism. His water quality monitoring showed the creek returning to pristine condition after elimination of drug processing contamination. The crisis had created lasting bonds throughout Cedar Ridge as townspeople supported each other's businesses more actively while maintaining vigilance against future threats. Doc Walsh organized weekly community meetings that strengthened social connections, ensuring collective response capability if criminal organizations targeted their valley again. Frank and Steven's friendship represented the story's central theme, that true strength came from character rather than physical prowess, and that experience combined with wisdom could triumph over youth and aggression when properly applied to protect innocent people. The two men sat on Frank's restored porch sharing coffee as sunset painted the sky in brilliant colors, their conversation comfortable and ranging from cattle prices to philosophy. Stars appeared in the Montana darkness as they reflected on satisfaction that came from duty properly fulfilled and justice successfully delivered. The peaceful sounds of cattle settling for the night provided background rhythm to their quiet discussion, representing life returned to normal but strengthened by knowledge that heroes, when needed, still walked among ordinary people ready to protect what mattered most. If you like the story, please watch another story on our channel and subscribe to the channel.